Okay, I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Weiss. I am proud to be a member of the FIJ board, and welcome to our first webinar this year of Inside the Investigation. This is an ongoing series of webinars. We're going to be doing them every month, usually the last Friday of the month. We started these for a couple of reasons. We get to shine a light on some of the really impactful and wonderful investigative work that reporters are doing all over the country, how they did their groundbreaking, and hear how they did their groundbreaking investigation. We get to hear concrete tips and about resources so that all of you and other reporters can do many of these investigations in your community, and today is a really good example. We get to feature investigations that were supported by the fund, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can apply for different grants that we offer. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk to Georgia probably for about 20 or 30 minutes. If you have questions, you can populate them at any point in the Q&A section. Also, we are recording this webinar, so you don't have to take copious notes because if you've registered for it, you're going to get a copy of the recording. We're also going to put it on the FIJ website as well as some of the tips. So with that, let's begin. I think we all know that there are some stories that are sort of buried and secret. No one knows or has heard about it. And then there's this story, the trash school. And this is a story, it's a kind of investigation, that tries to get at a problem that was literally out in the open for decades. And yet it was never fully addressed. The story begins in the 1950s in the city of Gainesville, Florida, where the city decided to place a landfill in the backyard of the Joseph Williams Elementary School. The dump was actually closed, but even after other environmental issues were discovered on the site, it was never fully cleaned up. So over decades, state and local officials have responded, they've taken action, but they've always fallen short of actually really addressing some of the long-term systemic problems. And this is what our guest, Georgia Gee, has investigated. She spent a year doing this investigation for The Intercept. It was based on hundreds of public and archival documents, government emails, records requests, interviews with residents. What she found is that after years of soil and air testing revealed a lot of evidence of environmental toxins on the property, of health sites, that this was not just a problem for this particular school, but it's actually a bigger problem across the country. Georgia is an investigative reporter, editor, producer, sort of a Swiss Army knife. She reported this story, as I said, for The Intercept. She was a core editor at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP. She reports for them regularly. She worked with Ronan Farrow at The New Yorker and HBO, and she's definitely a global citizen, a graduate of University College in London and the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. She currently lives in Nairobi. Georgia, we are really thrilled to have you, so thank you so much. So let me just start with that idea, like, how does a reporter based in Nairobi end up reporting on Gainesville, Florida? Where did this story come from?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming or watching this. It's very exciting to be here and talk about the story that was my life for so long. Actually, when I found this story, I was living in New York and I had filed many Freedom of Information requests during COVID under a completely separate project. And one day, 3 years after I'd filed the records request for the Florida Department of Health around COVID, this email popped in that finally I'd got my request back. Completely had forgotten about it. Wasn't even working on that project anymore, but that's kind of how records requests work. And so, yeah, I got it back and I was like, you know what, I may as well look through this. I've waited so long without knowing for these documents. And yeah, I looked through these documents. There were thousands and thousands of pages. A lot of them were completely irrelevant. And in was this nugget expressing concern about the health of children in East Gainesville, Florida. And Florida is a place that I have been, like, I have some family there. So I was very interested. And I also thought, wow, like children's health, pediatric asthma. And it was just in there from this nurse saying, yeah, I'm very concerned. I've seen there's environmental issues. Please, can someone reply to me? And her phone number and email was in the records request. And so I reached out to her. She was like, who are you? How do you know about my email? And it all kind of spiraled from there.
You know, like I said, this story really started in the 1950s. And, you know, I also said, like, it wasn't a secret. It wasn't something that people didn't know back. In fact, the name of your story, Trash School, was something that, you know, was what people refer to it locally. You know, you quote one article from local media that describes the landfill, the ditches filled with black stagnant mortar pumped from holes dug to hold garbage, right? But maybe you can pick up the story from, you know, its kind of origins and walk us through, like, what happened in this school or in this site over the next, you know, more than 60 years.
Yeah, so it's a story that goes back decades, and I can talk more later to how I even figured all of that out. But yes, the dump site was placed in the school. We still don't exist in the backyard of a school in the late 1950s. This was a predominantly Black area, very underfunded, very under-resourced. And they placed the landfill there. And it got coverage in local media because it was an absolutely insane situation. There were dead animals being dumped in the landfill. This is so close to where children, you know, were being taught but in their backyard. And so that happens. There's local outrage for a number of years until it's finally moved. Many crazy statements are made, and some of them are in the story. I've been looking through even more of them today and reminding myself of how awful some of the statements were at the time. It's
And I'm just going to
eventually after
say, this is a picture that shows a reflection of the dump in the back, right?
yes, this is taken by amazing Elise Swain for The Intercept. And so after the dump was placed there, after enough public, what they considered to be enough public outrage, it was moved to the airport. And after that, really, it's kind of forgotten. It comes up again 20 years later when they build on this. They try to build on the land, and the buildings sink and crack. And it remains a mystery, really. And then there is other environmental issues that come up. There are some underground oil tanks that are uncovered in the 1980s. Heating oil storage tanks were quite common at the time, and so that becomes the main focus of contamination on the land. But really, the landfill itself never really comes to be discussed again. Whether it's in environmental documents, it's informally in the community, but decades go by, people forget exactly what happened. And so there's cleanups every 20 years, maybe, to do with the underground oil tanks, but the landfill really just gets left behind and is never properly cleaned up.
Yeah, it you know, reading your story, I kept wondering, like, isn't there a federal or state law that sort of just basically says, hey, you can't put a toxic dump, you know, on the site of an elementary school. So is there any requirement, either at the federal level or at the state level, that you have to, like, you know, test the ground soil in advance if you want to build a school or a playground or expand a school?
So the short answer, no. There is no federal law that speaks to school sightings. There are EPA guidelines from 2011, which give discretionary advice about school sighting, but there is not one federal law. Each state has their own different laws, and under Florida law, you do have to run tests to understand the contamination and if it exposes children to risk before you place the school on. But this doesn't apply to already existing schools. So something like Joseph Williams Elementary has been there since the 1950s, even earlier. So there is no law that backdates you going back and dealing with that contamination. Some states are stricter than others, but there really is no one law that mandates school sighting.
So you had to report up this story. One of the things you had to do is you had to find the documents. Can you talk a little bit more? You said you started with a FOIA, but what else did you have to do, and how hard was it to kind of get to documentation? Because again, you have years and years and years of this school and of testing and of reporting about it. Talk a little bit about getting those building blocks to put the story together.
Sure. For this story, there were many different parts. I mean, I was lucky. I had what reporters would consider to be the perfect source, from finding that email and developing a relationship with the nurse who sent that email, who had looked at some of these documents, and many of them were available on the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and on FDOH. So yeah, state databases are your best friend if you know where to look. And she was lucky because she pointed me to the best way to look. And I downloaded all these documents and built massive timelines. And then I also started filing Freedom of Information Act requests to the county, to the school district. Not all of them came back, but some of them did. But the real gap, the hardest bit, was figuring out what happened from 1950 to 1990, because none of the FOIA or state database documents covered really any of that. And that I found by going to Gainesville and going to the local public library and searching their archive. And that was where I found all of the news reports for the landfill. The landfill wasn't even confirmed in my reporting until I found all of that. So local libraries, huge.
Wow, that's very very basic. I love that. Nothing fancy schmancy about that. It's often very difficult to show a direct link between a contaminant and adverse health effects. And I wondered, how did you go about addressing this in your reporting and writing? How did you go about, again, you couldn't say one caused the other, but you had to be able to kind of get us to understand that these things did influence each other. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's difficult, right? Because we're journalists and not scientists. And when so many different chemicals were coming up in all of these different reports, and I'm also hearing about the health impacts, it's hard to figure out how to correlate. I will say bringing experts in, speaking to academics that are experts on different chemicals or school siting or pollution or contamination or environmental injustice, they're just incredibly helpful resources. And this is their research. This is what they do every single day. So I spoke to a lot of different people, and also, then you can quote different people making different correlations. I also did a lot of different research on reports that existed before on the chemicals that were coming up that I was seeing and their link to, health impacts on children. What does it mean for children to be around pollution? And so I really built kind of a database of different reports that had existed. Whether or not they were the exact same thing, they never are, but they had different links so that I could begin correlating. And then I went with some of my findings and said to experts, hey, what does this mean? What can I realistically say? And I went into the community and I spoke to people about the state of their health and the trend. Investigative reporting is about identifying trends and patterns, right? And so the same thing was being repeated again and again with what people were suffering with. And so I felt at that point, all of those in a combination had risen to a level where I could point to different sources and facts that could make the correlations.
Yeah, and to that end, this is where we bring in the email. I think it's from a pediatric critical care nurse named Alexandria Owens. Can you tell us a little bit about, her role in this and kind of what she was seeing, and also having no idea of the history of what was going on in her community? Just maybe tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, so this Ali was someone who had never spoken to a journalist and was definitely like, well, who are you and what why are you reaching out to me? So that was very much about building the relationship and making sure that she felt safe and that the conversation that it was a relationship and a conversation we were building over time, and it was about me meeting her too and going to Gainesville. And she was somewhere, between a whistleblower and a source. Her emails were public, some of them, of her going and saying why they're not reports, so I could draw on those while asking her questions. But she really was, I think, a good story finds someone who can lead you through it, and she was that, because she was really pushing for the departments to answer questions about health, about the environment. And so, yeah, I built a relationship with her over a long time, and she really helped me walk through, and also I think is a formative character and person in the story. It wouldn't be without her, because she was the one that raised the alarm.
Right. You're a reporter from outside the community. You're trying to earn the trust of locals to talk about a story, that frankly a lot of people either didn't know about or kind of wanted to forget. How did you get people to trust you? What did you do? What was your trick?
There's just no substitute for going, and I was really lucky FYJ made that possible. Because yeah, I went. You can email as many people as you want, they're often not going to reply, and they're going to be like, who are you? And I pick up the phone with my British accent and they're very confused. So it was really about just going and walking around, and I feel like a lot of our job is waiting, going to a community event and just sitting there, saying, oh, okay, you can't speak now, let me take your number, can I come back later? And so it was just going there and showing people that I was really invested, showing them what I had found, being transparent about what I was doing, saying, I want to understand more, this is what I'm finding. And so that was really part of building the trust, was showing that I really cared about this story, and that I was really there to spend time and do what it took to make them also feel that it was accurate for accurate in representing what they had experienced. And
Can
this
you talk a
is
little
one
bit
of
about
my
this
sources.
character?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So this
tell
is
us a little
Wayne
bit about it.
Fields, an extremely bubbly and yet elusive man who never replied to an email before I set foot in East Gainesville, and then drove me around the entire community for a day. And so I just and was also very skeptical of who I was and why I was there. But after a while, we joked back and forth. We built somewhat of a friendship. And yeah, he drove me around, and he was there right from the beginning. He went to this school, his children went to this school, his parents were teachers at this school. But it was really about being there, because since I left, Wayne is a mystery. He doesn't pick up the phone. He doesn't like using email. I hope to go back and see him again, but that was really how I got to him, was just showing up. I went to his office for the day. It was just really putting the time in.
So I'm hearing such an interesting like mix of reporting tactics, right? You started with a FOIA, which was kind of like maybe it'll come, maybe it won't. But then, the documents were in the library. You had to go meet people in person, right? Because they're not answering your email, or even your phone calls. So it's really interesting to hear this combination of on the ground reporting, but also having the documents. How about officials? Again, it's an interesting situation. We often are dealing with like, oh, the officials, wouldn't recognize this was a problem. They would deny it. This is a case where like the state, the city kind of acknowledged it was an issue, and yet always seemed to fall short of acknowledging how big an issue it was, or even like what would be the most effective means. Was it hard? Was there anybody who like wouldn't talk to you? How did you, how did you approach kind of getting officials who could also give you responses to what kind of actions they were or weren't taking?
Yeah, it was really hard. And I was perhaps naive. I thought I would get there and show the school that I had all these documents and know that they were underfunded and think that they would want to talk to me. No one from the school wanted to talk to me. The principal didn't want to talk to me. So I didn't get into the school. I got onto the grounds, perhaps in a way that they would not have loved, but it was also a Sunday. But I didn't get into the school building, and I really wanted to. So that was really, really frustrating. And then officials, it was basically impossible. I emailed officials, even officials that had been outspoken about environmental injustice in the area, never responded, never got back to me. It was really hard to talk to anyone on an official level. Like even when I went to the city of Gainesville, when I reread my notes today, and the leadership told me that they had no specific knowledge because it was decades ago. So that would be history, and the leadership now don't know that. But there was many frustrating responses. Like I think it was FDOH said they would come back to me a week later, took months, and eventually, you have to publish. So I waited for a lot of answers that I never got. And that, I guess that spoke to the story more. And that was just part of what I had to deal with, was going in some ways without confirmation that I wanted from officials, but relying on documents and interviews in the community and of former employees. And there was an array of different sourcing that spoke to different things, but officials in this case were not responsive at all.
Right. In this case, you did have this sort of track record of reporting on it where you could pull officials' quotes from the past. It was just hard to get currently. Um, one of the things that you sort of discovered along the way, which might not surprise anybody, but is of interest to this group, is like, you know, communities of color suffer disproportionately from environmental toxins. When did you realize, like, oh, this is not just about Gainesville. There's something going on here nationally.
Yeah, I mean, reading reports, speaking to people, speaking to experts, learning about extremely racist housing laws, going to Gainesville and talking about what it was like, and also just seeing the development, seeing the west of Gainesville being unbelievably developed now and the east still not. So it was really about, I mean, this is a trend that we all know about, but it was about having more and more conversations, reading more and more reports, and just listening to the realities. And then starting to think about, as reporters do, oh, well, if this is happening here, where else is it happening? This maybe the landfill being in the backyard of a school is a particularly unique case, but how, with a lack of law, where else has this been happening? And that's when I also started building databases of other stories,
Yeah,
similar
and we'll get to that in a
stories.
minute. Yeah. The Intercept did something really interesting and kind of old school when it came to sharing your findings with the community, which is like you sent postcards. And I wonder
Mm-hmm.
if you could talk a little bit because it was both, I kind of thought it was like a sort of a sign of humility on the part, which is realizing like maybe this community is not going to read the Intercept, but this is the community that needs this information, first and foremost. And so I just wonder, like, who came up with that idea? And um, do you know if it worked? Do you know if, like, people paid more attention to the story or paid more attention to your findings? And what did the postcard
Yeah,
say?
it was a great. The postcards had the top findings. I mean, I think maybe 4 bullet points of what we found in the story. And I mean, I think about it a lot because I often work in either remote communities or places where they're not reading the Intercept or they're not reading where I'm writing for. And so in this case, also just speaking to people who had really no clue about the history of you know, that they'd really either forgotten, there were bigger concerns. I knew that I wanted them to have that record. But thinking about how to get there was really hard. We tried partnering with local news. It wasn't very responsive. I would have loved to do that as well. We tried partnering with local radio. Also, just this time wasn't successful. So the postcards were a way of, you know, reaching the community in something tangible. And yeah, I think that it was really helpful. One thing that happened is like there was just an array of events, and I don't think the postcards came out until a couple of months after the story published. So next time I would make sure that it happened at the same time, just to kind of have that push and that relevance. And even doing, I would have loved to do a community event or something like that, just to have answered more questions. But I think it definitely helped more people get to the story. Well, I hope. You know, you hope, I was saying this to Ellen before, so you hope one person reads the story at the end of the day. But to me, of course, I really wanted the community to read it, and I really wanted them to feel that it was accurate. And I got some good response from that. So that was encouraging.
Oh, that's great. I just want to remind the audience, please, start populating the Q&A with questions. This is an environmental story. It's about, going into a community where you have to build trust. It's about, covering history, how you cover something, from such a long time ago. What do you do when officials won't open up to you? So lots of areas for discussion. Um, what was the hardest part, of reporting the story? Like where did you hit your walls? Where you were just like, like I don't know how I'm gonna get through this one. I don't know what I'm gonna do. Or you called your lifeline for help, or you talked through with your editor. Where'd you hit your wall?
Yeah, having a really great editor, super grateful to Mariam from The Intercept, who really helped me through all of this, because I think when you're a year in, you're so in the weeds that you completely lose sight of, of the bigger picture. And so I think that was really hard. And this was also a really complicated story because you had the landfill and you had the oil tanks and you had all these chemicals and no real source indicating where exactly they came from. So trying to correlate all of that was really difficult, trying to figure out how much of the timeline to add in without people having to read through very specific intricacies that fundamentally probably aren't interesting. That was very difficult. Distilling down all the information was hard. And also once you leave, like I don't live in Florida, so then I left and some other things come up and you want, I couldn't go back at that point. So I think there were a lot of different various difficulties, but I think working so long on something and then having to put a fresh perspective on it, it was hard, and that's where a really good editor comes into the picture.
Great. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions. So one is, hi, Georgia. Thank you so much for sharing your process. Were you on staff or freelance when you pitched the story? And was it a long process getting it commissioned and funded? That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. No, I was not on staff. I was freelance and I have been ever since pretty much. And so I can't remember the exact way that I pitched it, but I think that I saw that the FIJ had seed grants, and I thought that there was enough of this story after having some conversations and looking through some of the documents that there was enough for this to be an initial idea. At this point, what's crazy is I didn't even know about the landfill. So I had a hunch and I went to FIJ, and I was lucky to have a good relationship with the Intercept, who I was writing for regularly. And I think that if you go to a publication and you say, well, you could publish this, but the main bulk of the resources will be funded somewhere else. I mean, that was quite appealing to them. So yeah, I was pretty lucky that there was interest in this story, because that's really not always the case, and I've experienced that many times. But FIJ had the seed grant, and the Intercept took a chance, and luckily, here this time it paid off. But yeah, not
Right.
always the case. The pitching funding is always difficult.
Yeah, and for those of you on the call, so a seed grant is a small grant, it's up to $2,500, and it's for that preliminary reporting that can lead to an investigation. But so whether it's an open records request, initial reporting trips, as George is describing, and the idea is it's that period of time when you have to invest, but you're not quite sure what the story is. So we have seed grants that are up to $2,500, and then you can apply for the full grant, which is up to $10,000. So that's what she's talking about. Another question, talk about that moment when you knew the email from the nurse buried in thousands of pages of documents was the nugget to make the story go. Do you have shortcuts for sifting through a massive trove of documents quickly?
Yeah, I love this question. I didn't know it was a go at the beginning at all, but I thought it was interesting, and I called Ali. And that was after that conversation. Well, you know what? Maybe even after that conversation, I wasn't completely persuaded because she hadn't even spoken to anyone about it yet, so it wasn't that coherent. But after a while, then she sent me the documents, and I think it probably took at least a month for me to be like, oh wow, there's really, really something here. Let me dig a bit deeper and see where it could go. And sifting through. So I think in part it's a gut feeling, but also it's doing the groundwork. And that is just the case with figuring out a story. It's very, very rare that it's going to get handed to you on a plate. Like you have to figure out, and especially with an investigation, you have to figure out what you're even looking for, right? And then with sifting through the massive trove of documents quickly, yeah, this is a huge part of my life always. I mean, I'm a quick scroller, but also keywords. At that point, I knew it was about COVID, it was about health. And so I think I, put in health, put in pediatric. I was looking for various different ways that key terms where things could pop up. So I think building a list of keywords is really important. And maybe if you're interested in a particular official, looking at what their emails were. I try and pinpoint a few avenues to go down. And I feel like when I go down those avenues with the keywords or the official or something, other things also come up on the periphery that then I also start to work in. If that makes sense.
And just remind us again, you might have said it, but what was in that email? What did she say that made you think like, huh?
She said something like, I am a pediatric nurse. I'm seeing a lot of children in the emergency room. I've seen the public documents about Williams Elementary because this was the documents about the oil tanks and the levels. And I believe there may be a correlation, and I'm very concerned. Can I speak to someone about this? And this was, by the time I got the documents, this was a good maybe 3 years later. And then I did a little groundwork and realized nothing had happened since. So realizing that there was this massive gap, I was like, well, I wonder if she still thinks about this. And she's an extremely smart, brilliant researcher in her own right. And she had been. So that when I called her, that was when it all kind of.
That's great.
Yeah.
Just remind us again how long you had to wait for that FOIA information.
That particular FOIA was like maybe 2-3 years, but that was on a COVID. I mean, the Florida Department of Health is notorious for slow responses. And that wasn't related directly to the story. I was lucky that the story was within the documents. But then when I filed for specific keywords under this story, I think I filed the school district and the county. It was much quicker. If you're doing a local story, going county or school district is the way to go. Going state is often really slow, and being very particular about your request. So I think it was a few months with school district. And then I also repeated the request again after I had been working on it for a while and wanted an update.
Got it. Great. Someone's asking about the seed funding. We do have rigid pitching deadlines. The next deadline is May 9th. We do 3 a year. So, and that's just so that we can look at everybody's requests, because sometimes even in when we may decide that someone who's going for the larger investigation, maybe it would be better for a seed grant rather than us rejecting them. So we'd like to have these conversations together, and we meet as a board to make all these decisions. So May 9th is the next deadline for seed funding. Next question, when did you decide it was enough information for publishing the story? Oh my gosh, this is everybody's challenge. Sometimes it seems like we have every single document, nothing is missing, and suddenly, surprise, there's more. Great question for you. I'm sure there was a moment when you were
Um,
like, when am I
yeah,
done?
I mean, it never felt like I had cracked it because there are still so many gaps that may never ever be answered over, why this was even placed there in the first place and because it was so long ago. I really wanted to keep going, keep going, keep going. But I think you get to a point where thousands of documents deep, you have the timeline, you have the interviews, you start to draft it, and you realize, okay, I need to start piecing this together. And I think there is a different feeling between feeling like you have not enough reporting. I knew I had enough reporting. I just wanted to go, 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 go. Like I just didn't want to stop. And that was where an editor came in and I said, hey, can I bounce this off you? Can I give you a first draft? And then you can tell me what you think. I had to kind of stop myself. And I think after going to Gainesville and making that trip, I knew that that was my one chance to really get what I could. And so after that was when I really had to start putting it together because I had all the documents before, but I didn't have the resources to go back to Gainesville. So I kind of had to do it. I had to move. But it's definitely, yeah, a difficult moment. And I think I could have kept going for a long time, but at some point you kind of have to stop yourself and say, remind yourself of what the main points in the story are and build from there. Sorry, I wish I could be more helpful in that because I think it's something we all
Oh, I think
struggle
it's
with.
an art, not a science
Yeah.
sometimes. Um, um, so what has been the impact of the reporting?
Yeah, to be candid, I wished for more. I wished that the officials were going to see it and say, okay, now we're going to demolish the school. Now we're going to listen to the concerns. And that hasn't happened. There has been more testing, even more rounds of testing, even more levels of different chemicals going up and down. Um, what's actually happening in the county government, if more funding has been allocated there, I don't know. I hope so. But I mean, it's encouraging that testing still happens, but yeah, the school hasn't been demolished and it hasn't been moved. The kids still go there. And I got community response. The community members reposted it. They read it. It got traction. But did I naively hope that it was really going to push officials to do something and have to answer questions? Yes. And, you know, that hasn't been the entire reality.
Yeah, yeah. One of the kind of exciting parts of your story where, it lives on and in particular interest I mentioned to this audience is you have been working with an academic. You sent someone all of your data, and using different databases, they've mapped all of the schools in the US that are located next to landfills. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what I understand. Can you talk a little bit about that work, about that decision? Maybe talk about sort of your timeline for releasing it, because I think the way I see that is it's sort of it is the hardest part of your reporting that now can scale to anybody in this phone call, I mean, on the Zoom and communities across the country to do very similar reporting because it's not just Gainesville. I think there are 35 states that have schools in this situation. So just talk a little bit about that decision, who you're working with, a little bit about who you're working with. Is this somebody you approached? Did they approach you? How did it come about?
Yeah, so after I did the Sea Grant and I published this story, and I realized, started thinking if this is happening anywhere else. And I was speaking to experts, and one of them was an academic. And they said, oh, I'm really interested in this research you're doing. You know what? I'm going to bring my grad school class onto this, and we're going to work with some data, and we're going to get back to you. And this is just really interesting for my field because they worked on environmental toxins in schools, so it very much overlapped. And so I was really lucky because this academic was extremely cooperative and extremely willing to help me and really cared about this. And so that's when I had started building my own database, and I think I got to like 150 schools, which is still a lot, but like I needed an academic, almost data zoom out. And this still hasn't been published, so there's only so much I can reveal. But yeah, that's when I started working on a national level, and I went back to FIJ and I said, "Oh, can I have a full grant now, please?" Because you've given me the seed one and I've exhausted it. And I think there's a bigger story here at play. And so, yeah, I think it's identifying patterns. I've done this in reporting before, realizing that a local story could be playing out in similar ways elsewhere. I also just spoke to people in the field and got really lucky that it has worked out that one was extremely interested in not working together, but being very open about their research with me. And yeah, I hope the story will be out soon. But that is also another case of deciding when to stop, and hard in this situation because I could keep going and going and going. And all the laws and all the different situations, you want to dig into every single one. So
Yeah,
you really have
it's
to
interesting too.
pull
I think
yourself
we
back.
also, yeah, we often talk about partnerships between journalism outlets, but I think increasingly, there are different kinds of partnerships inside a community. Academics, so you found an academic who could help you with the data work, and I think it's sometimes, especially for a freelancer or people who are working in like really small newsrooms, sometimes to look for help or look for collaboration in places that might not seem, a natural fit, but it turns out, can work out really well. Last question from me, which is, what do you wish you knew at the beginning that you had to learn the hard way?
Getting on the ground quicker would have answered a lot of questions, and getting to that library quicker would have answered a lot of questions. And I think also moving faster while it's still all in your brain. I think I came back from Gainesville and I waited a bit and I tried to piece things together, and it only became more convoluted, to be honest. And I think that there is only so much time. You have to piece things together. Everything, there are always confusions, and there are always nuances, and that's where you have an editor also to bounce stuff with. So I think keeping the pace in a very long investigation like this is really important, and getting on the ground and having conversations and not being afraid to. I'm not one of those people that feels really comfy knocking on doors. Like, it doesn't come naturally to me to expect that people will speak to me. In fact, sometimes I feel quite anxious about it. But the community was very welcoming, and I didn't really have much to fear once I was there. So I think it's just showing up and standing back and letting people realize that you care and that you're willing to give the time. I wish I'd gone earlier. Yeah, is a big one.
Yeah. I'm curious if you have any kind of science background or how hard it was to kind of deal with chemicals and science and scientific studies. That would have been really intimidating for me. I think that's where I would hit my roadblock, but I'm wondering, how much of a student of science and chemistry did you have to become?
Yeah, other than doing my science exams when I was 16, not at all a scientist. Brain doesn't work in that way. I like data, but I'm not a scientist. And I would say this was my first really like big environmental investigation. And now, after I've done it once, I feel I've done it many times since, and I feel much better about doing it. I think again, it's the experts, it's reading other reports, it's really admitting that you actually don't know. Like, it's calling up an academic and saying, hey, like, I really don't want to waste your time. So if you don't have it, that's fine. But if you do, can you just explain to me what this chemical means? And what does it mean for it to be at this level? It's just asking people. And who are way more knowledgeable than you, is really the reality. And I think for me, building comprehensive timelines just to identify patterns in the data is really important. Figuring out the way that you can organize the data best for you and your brain so that it doesn't become too overwhelming. It's something that I just really rely on in my work. Yeah, and talking to people. And again, I think that's something I wish I did earlier too, is it's okay to ask an academic, what this means. They actually really like it. So I think that's how I approach it, is being organized about what I have and then asking the right questions to the right people. And they're
That's
not always
great.
friendly, but often they are.
Yeah, people do love to talk about their work. I would love to hear from anybody on the Zoom who has done environmental reporting. If you have any tips that you want to share, I think sometimes it can be really intimidating to go into an area of like science where it feels like there should be precision, it feels like there should be answers, and yet it is often so hard to actually get to an answer. So if anyone else has any other tips and any other questions for Georgia, for FIJ, going once, twice. Okay, I'm going to share my screen one more time, and because I want to just go over, whoops, that's the wrong one. Let's see. I want to give you just one places about the grants that are coming up. Okay, there we go. All right. So again, just to review, we review proposals 3 to 4 times a year. The regular grants up to $10,000. The next deadline is Monday, April 28th. The seed funding, which we talked about, and Georgia, thanks for the shout outs for that. We have found this to be, such a wonderful way of getting people from a seed funding to a regular grant. So really, if you think you have an idea, you want to develop a little further, think about applying for these. That deadline is May 9th. We also have follow-up grants. If you want to do more follow-up coverage, you can also apply for a follow-up grant of $2,500. So think about all of that. As I said, Georgia, we will be able to post Georgia's mapping story on the FIJ website. Everyone who registered, you're going to get an email from FIJ sometime next week with a link to the recording of the webinar. And our next webinar is, what do I want to say? It's at the end of April. I can't remember the date, but you'll get an email from us. Also, if you have any questions about applying, if you want to make a suggestion about, the webinars, you can email us at grants@fij.org. And if you go to the FIJ website, there's an FAQ, there's other resources, there's a video to help you with the application process. Sometimes it can be confusing. So hopefully all of you will think about applying for grants. We love to support investigative reporting like Georgia's. Georgia, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who joined, and have a great weekend. Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.